biting wind swept across the flat Wisconsin fields in November 1943 as the first trains screeched to a halt at Camp McCoy. The iron doors opened, and hundreds of weary men in faded Afrika Korps uniforms stepped down, boots crunching against snow. They expected to see snarling guards, snarled barbed wire, and barking dogs. Instead, they saw something entirely different, a vast agricultural landscape, dotted with barns and silos, stretching out like an endless stage. The war had thrown them here, 4,000 miles from their homeland, and their shock would deepen with every passing hour. The United States had shipped more than 371,000 German prisoners of war to American soil between 1943 and 1946. Camps like Camp McCoy, set in Monroe County, Wisconsin, were part of an immense logistical web, over 500 sites scattered across 46 states. The numbers alone were staggering. The United States, fighting a global war, found itself not just feeding and housing these men, but deciding how to use their labor. And in a nation where food production was deemed as crucial as ammunition, the answer was simple: send them to the fields. But for the prisoners stepping off those trains, the shock wasn't just in the cold air. It was in what they didn't see. No starvation, no collapsing infrastructure, no ruinous bomb craters like the ones that scarred Hamburg. The farmhouses were lit, their chimneys puffing steady smoke, and ordinary American workers carried themselves with a prosperity that seemed impossible for a nation at war. In Germany, even ration cards had become more paper than substance. Here, the smell of bread and bacon drifted across the camp fence. Among those men was Obergefreiter Karl-Heinz Vogel, who scribbled into a small diary that he managed to hide from inspections, "I thought America was propaganda. But the barns are bigger than our factories, and the cattle are fatter than our officers." Such words, smuggled into lined paper, reveal the rupture forming inside him. He was trained to believe America was weak, divided, incapable of war. Instead, he encountered abundance. The guards herded the men toward barracks built of fresh pine, sunlight glinting off the new nails that held them together. For Karl-Heinz, the sharp smell of sawdust was another insult to the propaganda he had swallowed. The Americans weren't crumbling, they were building, with a speed and scale Germany couldn't match. A single B-24 bomber rolled out of Ford's Willow Run plant every 63 minutes. Here in Wisconsin, dairy farmers filled quotas that dwarfed anything back home. This was not the fragile enemy he had been taught to despise. And so, before a single shovel was lifted, before a single field assignment was handed out, the psychological war had begun. The prisoners stood in silence, boots soaking into the snow, realizing that the land of their enemy was not collapsing but flourishing. That shock would fester, turning to disbelief, and finally, to an unspoken respect. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? The first true shock came not with the fences or the barracks, but with the tools. A few days after their arrival, the prisoners were loaded into trucks and driven down snow-packed rural roads toward nearby farms. They expected to be treated like criminals, watched under rifle sights while doing menial work. Instead, American farmers walked right up to them, placed saws, hammers, and even tractors into their hands, and then stepped back as if trust were the most natural thing in the world. At the Giese family farm near Sparta, Wisconsin, Sergeant Wilhelm Drexler, a former carpenter from Bremen, was asked to mend a broken barn door. He later confided in a letter never sent home, "They give us iron nails, sharp tools, and leave us alone with their livestock. In Germany, we would never hand such things to a captured enemy. Here, it is as if they believe we cannot betray their trust." That entry, preserved when censors confiscated the letter, reveals the extraordinary dissonance. For men who had been drilled to see themselves as dangerous enemies, to be treated as ordinary laborers was destabilizing, almost humiliating. The farmers needed them desperately. By 1943, the U.S. had drafted more than 16 million men, draining the countryside of its young workforce. Women and older men held farms together, but harvest seasons loomed like impossible deadlines. Statistics underline the urgency. Wisconsin produced nearly 3 billion pounds of milk in 1944, feeding both civilians and soldiers abroad. without extra hands. The system would have buckled, and so the prisoners became unlikely saviors of America's breadbasket. Yet, there was gossip even in those quiet barns. One prisoner muttered in disbelief when he realized the farmer's son, barely 16, drove a tractor larger than the tank he once rode across North Africa. Another was caught staring at a simple lunchbox the farmer's wife had packed: a sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of coffee. To men accustomed to watery soup and black bread back home, such rations seemed decadent. Whispered arguments erupted in the barracks at night. Was this all an elaborate trick? Or was America truly this rich? Trust was not always without risk. Tools could become weapons, and rumors circulated of prisoners pocketing nails or hiding blades. But American guards, often just local men in uniform, rarely interfered. They leaned against fence posts, rifles slung casually, chatting more with the farmers than with each other. For the prisoners, this casualness stung deeper than hostility. It said, wordlessly, "We are not afraid of you." And so each day ended with calloused hands, sawdust clinging to uniforms, and eyes that no longer looked upon the tools as weapons, but as instruments of survival. The hammer and the spade were no longer symbols of captivity, but of something stranger, a fragile, disorienting trust that undermined the very ideology they carried from Europe. By the spring of 1944, the rhythm of rural America had swallowed the prisoners into its routine. Dawn began with the rooster's cry and the distant hum of tractors already rolling across frosted fields. German soldiers who once marched in columns across desert landscapes now followed American farmers into barns, fields, and workshops. The lines between captor and captive began to blur in daily gestures: a shared meal at a kitchen table, a nod of approval when a furrow was plowed straight, a silent pause at sundown as both men leaned on shovels, staring at the horizon. At the Kessler farm outside Toma, Obergefreiter Karl-Heinz Vogel, the same man who once scoffed at American barns, found himself mucking stalls alongside the farmer's teenage daughter, Clara. Her laughter when a cow sneezed hay into his face cut sharper than barbed wire. He later scribbled in his diary, "I never imagined a farmer's child could look at me without fear. In Bremen, we were taught the enemy was monstrous. Here, I'm treated like a man with dirty boots. Nothing more." Those lines, confiscated but later archived, reveal how ordinary moments began to dismantle the scaffolding of hate. Statistics tell part of this transformation. By the summer of 1944, over 90,000 German POWs were working in U.S. agriculture, producing millions of bushels of corn, wheat, and soybeans in Wisconsin alone. Prisoner labor accounted for nearly 20% of the seasonal workforce. Yet behind these numbers were small, unspoken intimacies: a farmer's wife passing a tin cup of cold well water to a prisoner, hands brushing briefly, or a boy offering a piece of chewing gum to men who had never seen it before. Each moment was minor, almost invisible, but collectively they rewrote how these men saw their enemy. Not every scene was idyllic. Some farmers refused to share meals, insisting the prisoners eat outside, under guard. Others locked away their wives and daughters when the trucks rolled in. But even in those places, something pierced the walls of suspicion. One gossip spread among the prisoners about a farmer's wife who left a plate of cookies on a fence post every Friday, never speaking a word, never being seen. Yet the cookies never failed to appear. To men who had seen executions for stealing food in North Africa, the mystery of this silent generosity gnawed at their convictions. Humanity was not always tender. There were stares heavy with suspicion, muttered insults in German, and guards who reminded them they were still enemies. Yet the balance shifted day by day. Prisoners no longer counted the hours of captivity by barbed wire, but by the cycles of planting, harvesting, and mending. Trust was not proclaimed, it was lived. In the creak of barn doors they repaired, in the steady rhythm of hammers striking nails, and in the smell of bread cooling on farmhouse windowsills. Night inside the barracks was rarely silent. After long hours in the fields, the prisoners returned to wooden bunks where arguments, whispers, and confessions filled the air. The faint glow of a single bulb swung from the ceiling, casting restless shadows across faces hardened by war. This was when doubts, gossip, and secret observations spilled out, captured in diaries, smuggled letters, or in the rare courage to speak aloud. Gefreiter Otto Brandt, once a mechanic in Hamburg, Scribbled in his hidden notebook, the Americans drink coffee as if it were water. They even give it to children. I asked myself, if they waste such things, how much more do they have? His words, bitter yet tinged with awe, reflect the astonishment that repeated itself in every barrack. Coffee, sugar, butter luxuries in Germany appeared here not as rare treats, but as everyday staples. The prisoners could not believe that guards, farmers, even factory workers could live better than German officers. Another entry, this one from Karl-Heinz Vogel, struck deeper. The farmer's son brought me a lunch of meat and potatoes. In camp I eat cabbage soup, but at work they give me food fit for officers. What sort of enemy feeds his foe like family? The censors seized the page, but even confiscated words traveled, whispered from bunk to bunk. Soon, gossip about American abundance was as common as the sound of the wind rattling loose boards. These moments eroded certainty. For years, propaganda had told them America was fractured by race and greed, and yet, one POW recalled his shock when a black farmhand worked side by side with a white farmer, both laughing at a broken wagon wheel. He wrote later, "In Germany, this would be impossible. Here, it is ordinary." The ideology of superiority that had driven their war began to crumble under the weight of daily, mundane observation. Still, there was tension. Some prisoners accused others of being seduced, of forgetting their duty. Heated arguments erupted, with fists occasionally flying in the dim barracks. One man slammed his tin cup against the wall, shouting that all this comfort was a trick to weaken their resolve. Another fell silent after seeing the farmer's wife read a letter at sunset, tears in her eyes. Her family also divided by war. Silence often said more than anger. By 1944, U.S. reports noted a steady psychological shift among POWs. Surveys revealed that nearly half admitted admiration for American efficiency, though few dared confess it openly. Tools and tasks had begun their quiet work of undoing ideology. But it was in these diaries, in the small exchanges of gossip and confession, that the transformation found its clearest voice. And so each night closed not with certainty, but with questions whispered into darkness. Were they still soldiers, or were they now witnesses to a truth their homeland had hidden from them? The wooden walls of the barracks held the echoes of doubt, heavier than any chain. Trust was a fragile thing, and it cracked often. In the summer of 1944, a prisoner named Ernst Kappel slipped away from a hayfield near Sparta. For 2 days he hid in the woods, armed with nothing but stolen bread and a rusted pocket knife. The news swept through the county, whispers running faster than the local newspapers. Farmers double-checked their barns at night, children were kept inside, and guards patrolled with sharper eyes. Yet, when Ernst was finally found, exhausted, shivering, and asking for water at a roadside diner, the sheriff simply returned him to camp. No shots, no beatings. The lesson for the other prisoners was clear here. Even escape ended not in execution, but in mercy. Suspicion lingered in smaller moments too. At the Mueller farm, a hammer went missing. The farmer's wife accused a prisoner of theft, her voice sharp with fear. The guards investigated, tension boiling in the midday sun. Hours later, the hammer turned up in the hayloft, misplaced by the farmer's own son. The incident became fodder for barrack gossip. Some prisoners mocked the panic. Others admitted they'd never seen an American apologize to a German before. That apology, awkward, brief, muttered under a breath, carried more weight than the hammer itself. And then there were moments when trust was not cracked, but deepened by simple acts of humanity. One afternoon, as prisoners labored in the fields under a relentless July sun, a young farmer's daughter, no more than 12, carried a bucket of cool water out to them. She offered the ladle without hesitation, hands trembling slightly as calloused fingers brushed against hers. To the men, this was not just kindness, but a collapse of boundaries. Here was a child who should have feared them, yet she offered water as though they were weary laborers, not sworn enemies. One prisoner would later recall in his diary that sip of water was heavier than any weapon. It broke something inside me. The gossip spread quickly, the story of the girl who gave water. Some prisoners scoffed, others sat in silence, staring at their hands. By nightfall, even the most hardened voices had quieted. Trust, suspicion, humanity, they all mixed in that simple gesture. Statistics remind us that these contradictions played out across a vast scale. In 1944 alone, German POWs contributed nearly 45 million man-hours of farm labor in the Midwest. Yet, behind each number was a human story: suspicion, forgiveness, and moments of startling tenderness that refused to be explained by ideology. For you watching now, let me ask, if you were a farmer in 1944, would you have handed a hammer to a captured soldier who might still dream of escape? Or would you have locked your tools away? Share your thoughts in the comments. By the winter of 1945, the war's tide had turned. In Europe, German cities lay in ruins under Allied bombing raids. Yet in Wisconsin, the barns still stood, warm light spilling through their windows onto snow. For the prisoners, news arrived in fragments: a whispered headline from a guard, a crumpled newspaper discarded in town, a Red Cross bulletin pinned to the camp wall. They learned of Stalingrad, of Normandy, of the firestorm in Dresden. Each report chipped away at what little certainty remained. The war they had fought for was ending, and the enemy who had armed them with tools seemed, impossibly, to be winning with kindness as much as with tanks. As spring came in 1945, farmers prepared fields for planting, and the prisoners knew their time was nearly over. Trucks carried them out one last time, the smell of freshly turned earth hanging in the cool air. They mended fences, stacked hay, and repaired machinery with an odd sense of finality. Sergeant Wilhelm Drexler, the carpenter, left his initials carved into a barn beam, a quiet mark of presence that the farmer would discover decades later. Karl-Heinz Vogel wrote in his final diary entry before departure, "I came here with hate. I leave with questions. The farmer's hammer felt heavier than my rifle ever did." Departures began in late 1945, stretching into 1946. Train platforms once again filled with columns of men, now carrying small bags and staring back at the fields they had worked. Farmers stood silently by, some shaking hands, others merely watching. A few slipped letters or photographs into prisoner pockets, keepsakes of bonds formed in silence. Statistics record that 371,683 German POWs were eventually repatriated from the United States. But the numbers cannot capture the quiet glances exchanged across platforms, or the feeling of leaving behind barns larger than factories, tractors larger than tanks. Not all memories were tender. Some prisoners confessed to fearing their return more than captivity. They knew they would face rubble, hunger, and suspicion back home. A few murmured in disbelief that America had fed them better than their own government. One guard remembered hearing a prisoner mutter in Germany, "We fought for bread. In America, even the pigs eat bread." Such words were dangerous to speak aloud, but impossible to forget. The last trucks rumbled away, the camps emptied, and the barbed wire sagged under winter snow. Yet the prisoners carried home more than clothes or diaries. They carried the memory of trust, of being handed saws, plows, and hammers by those they once called enemies. It was a memory that would haunt them in rebuilding their homeland, shaping how they spoke of democracy, of work, and of what it meant to be trusted. So let me ask you, the audience, if you had been one of those men, stepping onto a train in 1946, what would you have carried in your heart? Bitterness, gratitude, or confusion? Tell us in the comments. When the camps finally closed, silence lingered where the noise of saws and hammers had once echoed, in barns across Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. A peculiar trace remained: tools that had passed through German hands, bearing the marks of labor done in captivity. One farmer in Vernon County noticed a hammer resting on the wall, its wooden handle smoothed by use. It had been left behind by a prisoner whose name he never knew. The farmer never moved it. For years, it hung there, a silent reminder that trust had once been extended across enemy lines. For the men who returned to Germany, that same hammer or its memory became a symbol of contradiction. They had been soldiers trained to destroy. Yet in America, they had been treated as men who could build. Diaries captured the strangeness. Otto Brandt, the mechanic, wrote upon his return to Hamburg, "I dreamed of the barn where we worked. The hammer was still in my hand. When I woke, I realized I was holding nothing." His wife later told neighbors he often stared at broken buildings in silence, as if waiting for someone to hand him tools again, The statistics frame the scale. Between 1943 and 1946, German POWs completed over 100 million man-hours of labor in the United States. Yet beyond those numbers, it was the intangible exchanges: a cup of water, a plate of cookies, a farmer's apology that forged the deepest impressions. These were not battlefield victories, but victories of perception, victories of humanity. Even decades later, when reunions were held between former prisoners and American farmers, the stories returned always to the same objects: the hammer, the saw, the tractor. These tools were not instruments of war, but of a fragile trust that somehow endured when ideologies crumbled. For the prisoners, they represented a world where enemies could choose to see each other not as threats, but as men capable of honest work. The hammer on that barn wall gathered dust. Seasons turned, children grew, farms changed hands. Yet it remained untouched, as though waiting for someone to remember the day when a tool was given freely to an enemy. A simple object, yet heavy with meaning. It symbolized not just survival, but a question that echoed long after the camps closed: can trust once given ever truly be forgotten? When the war ended, the men returned across the Atlantic to a Germany scarred by rubble, hunger, and silence. Yet, hidden inside them, carried like contraband across borders and years, was the memory of something disarming being trusted with tools. It was not propaganda or speeches that stayed with them, but the weight of a hammer, the smell of sawdust, the rhythm of work on foreign soil. These memories lingered long after uniforms were shed and flags lowered. Some of those men rebuilt their homes with the same techniques they had learned on American farms. Others never spoke of their time in captivity, ashamed of both defeat and unexpected kindness. But in letters, in quiet conversations decades later, stories surfaced of barns where a farmer's daughter offered water, of fields where machines roared larger than tanks, of kitchens where coffee was poured without suspicion. They told of a paradox that no doctrine could erase: that they had seen an enemy who did not fear them, who handed them tools instead of chains. History records battles and treaties, but it is often the smaller gestures that shape memory. A forgotten hammer on a barn wall in Wisconsin, a diary line scrawled under dim light, a sip of water on a hot July day. These were the details that transformed hardened soldiers into men who questioned the very ideology that had once consumed them. The abundance of America did not just overwhelm them with numbers and production, it humbled them through trust. Tonight, as you reflect on this story, perhaps imagine that hammer still hanging in a quiet barn, gathering dust yet refusing to disappear. It is more than wood and iron. It is a reminder that even in times of war, trust can leave behind echoes louder than gunfire. And in those echoes lies a lesson not just about history, but about the fragility and endurance of our shared humanity.